The soft, mournful notes of Grace Sterling's violin wove through the smoky haze of the casino bar, a delicate counterpoint to the relentless clinking of glasses and the distant chime of slot machines. At 26, she felt the weight of years beyond her age. Each stroke of her bow was a whisper of overdue rent, a quiet plea against the mounting medical debts her late mother had left behind. Grace was tired, bone-deep weary from being the responsible one, always the one holding things together. She longed with a quiet desperation for just one night where she wasn't the anchor, where the world's burdens didn't rest squarely on her slender shoulders. The bar was a cavern of muted luxury, plush velvet and polished dark wood, absorbing the city's electric pulse. She played to a scattering of indifferent patrons, feeling both exposed on the small stage and utterly invisible. Her music, usually a source of solace, tonight felt like another task, another obligation. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the melody wash over her, a brief escape from the neon glare outside and the dull ache in her own heart. When she opened them again, her gaze snagged on a man seated alone at a corner table. He hadn't been there before. He was a stark silhouette against the soft glow of a nearby lamp, his presence a heavy, undeniable force. He was older, perhaps late 30s, and radiated an almost dangerous stillness. Where others in the opulent room glittered with an artificial sheen, he simply was. His tailored suit seemed to absorb the light. His dark eyes, even from this distance, held an intensity that both unnerved and fascinated her. He wasn't looking at her violin, not really. He was looking at her. A strange tremor ran through Grace. It was a sensation she hadn't felt in years, a prickle of awareness that cut through her exhaustion. He was a predator, she instinctively knew. But there was no malice in his gaze, only a deep, unwavering observation. He was studying her, dissecting her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Grace felt truly seen. It was frightening, yet exhilarating. He was everything her carefully constructed, responsible life wasn't. Wild, untamed, utterly powerful. Her set finished. The last note of her violin hanging in the air before being swallowed by the bar's low hum. She carefully placed her instrument back in its case, her hands trembling slightly. As she moved to gather her few belongings, a deep voice, surprisingly soft yet resonant, cut through the din. "Another drink?" He was standing beside her, silent as a shadow. Up close, he was even more imposing. He towered over her, his broad shoulders seeming to block out the rest of the room. His eyes, dark as obsidian, held hers captive. They were not unkind, but they held an unyielding command, a silent expectation she found herself powerless to resist. His presence was overwhelming, a physical manifestation of power that made her feel small, fragile, and oddly protected. Grace had never been reckless. Her life was a meticulously planned sequence of obligations and responsibilities. But in that moment, under his unwavering gaze, feeling the sheer scale of his authority wash over her, something shifted. The yearning she'd suppressed for so long, the desire for one night where she wasn't in control, surged to the surface. He was danger. He was the unknown. And in her weariness, he felt like the only escape. She looked up at him, her heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. His hand, large and strong, rested briefly on the back of the empty chair she had just vacated, a possessive gesture that both startled and captivated her. "Yes," she heard herself say, her voice barely a whisper. "Please." It was a reckless surrender, a decision made in a fragile moment of exhaustion and longing. She had no idea who he was, or the storm she was inviting into her carefully guarded life. All she knew was that for this one night, she desperately wanted to let go. The morning light filtered through heavy, unfamiliar curtains, painting the opulent high-roller suite in shades of muted gold. Grace stirred, her body protesting with a gentle ache she couldn't quite place. For a long moment she lay still, disoriented, the plush silk sheets a stark contrast to her worn cotton at home. The air, thick with the faint, expensive scent of a man's cologne, was the first clue. She opened her eyes, blinking. This wasn't her tiny apartment, cluttered with sheet music and overdue bills. This was luxury, a silent testament to a night she barely remembered in detail, but felt in the lingering hum of her nerves. The space beside her in the vast bed was empty, the sheets cool where another body had been. He was gone. A strange cocktail of emotions washed over her. There was the immediate sting of apprehension, a vague unease about the unknown consequences of her impulsive surrender. But quickly, it was joined by a profound sense of relief. No awkward goodbyes, no forced conversation, no lingering questions, just gone. And beneath it all, a surprising surge of exhilaration. She had done something utterly reckless, something entirely out of character, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, she felt a peculiar, almost rebellious sense of liberation from the usual shackles of her responsible life. She pushed herself up, the silk slipping against her skin. On the polished bedside table, beside an ornate lamp, lay a crumpled room keycard. A single broken heel from her favorite performing shoes lay discarded by the door, a small, tangible casualty of her wild night. They were the only physical proofs, silent witnesses to a decision made in a moment of emotional fragility. Grace moved slowly, gathering her clothes, her movements quiet in the vast, silent suite. The memories were fragmented, hazy, like a dream just out of reach. His deep voice, the intensity of his gaze, the overwhelming sense of his physical power as he led her away from the bar. She remembered feeling small, utterly consumed by his presence, and yet paradoxically safer than she had in years. It had been a fleeting sensation, a borrowed strength, but it had been potent. Now, with the morning sun illuminating the stark reality of his absence, Grace felt a renewed resolve. This was a secret indulgence, a brief, anonymous escape from her grinding reality. She didn't know his name, nor did she care to. He was a stranger, a powerful, dangerous man who had offered a moment of oblivion, and she had taken it. That was all it needed to be. Her usual life, with its endless responsibilities and financial burdens, suddenly felt heavy again, pulling her back down to earth. The memory of his commanding voice, the way his hand had briefly rested on the chair, a silent claim she hadn't resisted, faded into the background. She would put this night behind her, tuck it away in a corner of her mind, never to be revisited. Her focus had to return to what mattered: the overdue rent, the violin lessons, the mountain of debt. With a final glance around the lavish room, a world so far removed from her own, Grace pulled open the heavy door. She would walk away, leaving no trace, and he would do the same. This one night, this reckless surrender, would remain her secret. She was sure of it. Weeks bled into weeks, the sharp edges of that impulsive night slowly blurring into a hazy memory. Grace had thrown herself back into her routine with a ferocity born of denial. Her violin lessons filling her days, her lounge performances, her nights. The casino bar, once a stage for a moment of reckless abandon, now felt like a cage she couldn't escape. She had tried to forget, to bury the lingering scent of expensive cologne and the memory of those commanding dark eyes beneath layers of sheet music and overdue bills. But her body, it turned out, had a different plan. A persistent nausea, subtle at first, became a constant companion. A strange, bone-deep weariness settled into her limbs, far beyond her usual exhaustion. Food she once loved now repulsed her, and her senses seemed heightened, the neon lights of the strip more garish, the casino noise more grating. Grace, ever the responsible one, tried to rationalize it away: stress, lack of sleep, poor diet. But deep down, a quiet dread began to unfurl. The home test confirmed it, the two faint lines on the stick obliterating her carefully constructed world. Grace stared at it, her hand trembling, the small plastic stick, a monumental weight. Fear, cold and absolute, gripped her heart. How? How could one night, one fleeting moment of surrender, shatter everything? Despair warred with a new, fierce, protective instinct that surged through her, primal and overwhelming. She was alone, utterly alone, with a secret that felt too immense to carry. Days later, a sonogram image was tucked carefully into her violin case, nestled amongst her sheet music, like a fragile, precious secret. It was a tiny, shadowy form, a being of life that was undeniably hers. Looking at it, Grace felt a profound shift. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath her skin, but it was now tempered by a fierce resolve. She would protect this child, this tiny emblem of a new, terrifying responsibility. She would disappear, leave Las Vegas, find a quiet corner of the world where no one knew her name, and certainly where the father, the powerful stranger from that night, would never know of their existence. She would raise this child alone, just as she had always faced everything else. Her mind raced with plans, contingency strategies, the logistics of vanishing. She had just finished her set at the hotel, the last notes of her violin still echoing in her ears, when the world outside the service entrance exploded. She was about to step into the cool night air, clutching her violin case, when the sleek black car pulled up with a silent menace. Before she could process it, another vehicle screeched to a halt, blocking its escape. The air, usually filled with the distant hum of traffic, was suddenly ripped apart by a sickening thud, then the sharp, brutal crack of gunfire. Grace froze, pressed against the brick wall, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes, wide with terror, saw a flash of movement, men in dark suits emerging from the second car, their faces grim, efficient. They moved with a chilling precision, dragging a struggling figure from the first vehicle, a brief, horrifying struggle, then more shots. Blood blossomed on the pavement, a stark, ugly stain beneath the indifferent glow of a distant street lamp. It was a brutal, professional hit, unfolding with terrifying speed just meters from where she stood. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer, unbridled violence. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. Just as she thought it was over, just as the men in dark suits began to retreat, one of them, his face hard and unreadable, turned his head. His eyes, devoid of humanity, swept across the alley, and then they locked onto hers. A cold, dawning horror spread through Grace. He had seen her. They had seen her. Panic, raw and absolute, seized her. This wasn't just a random act of violence she had stumbled upon. She was a witness, and as the dark car sped away, leaving behind only the chilling silence and the lingering smell of gunpowder and blood, a worse realization clawed its way into her mind. The hotel, the surveillance cameras that dotted every inch of the property. The powerful man from that night. She didn't know his name, but she knew he was important, dangerous even. And now, these killers, these brutal men, would know she had been with him. The tiny, precious secret tucked into her violin case, the burgeoning life within her, suddenly felt like a target, a vulnerable, devastating weapon. Grace, the quiet musician, the responsible daughter, was no longer just running from her past. She was caught in a web of violence and power she couldn't possibly comprehend, and she was utterly, terrifyingly exposed. Grace ran, her breath tearing in her lungs, the frantic beat of her heart echoing the thud of her worn sneakers on the cracked pavement. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant siren a chilling promise of capture. She clutched her violin case to her chest, the sonogram tucked inside, feeling like a fragile, damning secret. The images of the brutal cartel hit outside the hotel flashed behind her eyes. The cold, dead gaze of the man who had seen her face burning into her memory. They knew she was a witness. Worse, they knew she was connected to him, the powerful stranger whose name she still didn't know. The city, once a glittering haven, had become a terrifying labyrinth, and she was trapped. A pair of headlights suddenly flared behind her, too close, too fast. Grace risked a glance back, her blood turning to ice. A dark sedan, identical to the one she'd seen fleeing the scene of the murder, was gaining on her, its engine a low, predatory growl. Panic, pure and unadulterated, propelled her forward, but her legs were screaming in protest. She was a musician, not a runner, and the city was vast. There was no escape. Just as the sedan began to pull alongside her, a sudden, blinding flash of light erupted from the intersection ahead. A convoy of black SUVs, sleek and menacing, materialized out of the night, moving with an almost military precision. They converged on the cartel car, boxing it in before the driver could even react. Tires screeched, metal shrieked, and then silence, stark and absolute, descended. Grace stumbled to a halt, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a fresh wave of terror. Was this another attack? Were these more of them? Then the door of the lead SUV opened, and a figure emerged, silhouetted against the neon glow of the strip. He was tall, powerfully built, his presence a thunderclap in the sudden quiet. Hunter King, the stranger from that night. He was a figure of absolute authority, his very stillness radiating a dangerous command that brought his men to action even before he spoke. The cartel thugs, disoriented and outmatched, were swiftly and brutally neutralized, their struggles brief against the organized force. He turned his head, his dark gaze sweeping over the scene, then settling on her. Grace felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Up close, his power was overwhelming, a physical force that pressed down on her, stealing her breath. She was stunned, the implications of her one-night stand crashing down with dizzying speed. This wasn't just a rich man. He was the Hunter King, the city's most feared tycoon, the man who secretly controlled so much. And she was carrying his child. He walked towards her, his movements fluid and purposeful, never breaking eye contact. She tried to speak, tried to protest, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat. He stopped before her, towering, his shadow enveloping her, his voice, low and gravelly, cut through the last vestiges of her panic. "You're under my protection now, Grace." It wasn't a question, nor a suggestion. It was a declaration, an unyielding command that brooked no argument. His hand, large and warm, settled on her arm, a possessive grip that left no room for doubt. She was swept away, her protests futile against his decisive power. His men moved with silent efficiency, guiding her into the back of one of the SUVs, her violin case placed carefully beside her. The drive was long, the glittering lights of Las Vegas slowly receding into the distance, replaced by the vast, dark expanse of the desert. She was taken to his heavily guarded desert compound, a fortress far from the city's lights. As they pulled up to the formidable gates, Grace gazed out at the high walls, the watchtowers, the endless, empty desert stretching beyond. The stark contrast between her fragile, gentle world and his harsh, uncompromising environment was overwhelming. She felt like a small bird in a golden cage, trapped and terrified. Yet as the gates swung open and the SUV drove into the secure perimeter, a strange, unexpected sensation began to unfurl deep within her. The immense burden of her financial struggles, the constant threat of eviction, the fear of raising a child alone, the raw terror of being hunted, it was all suddenly, inexplicably, lifted. Hunter King, this powerful, dangerous man, had taken charge. His presence was a heavy weight, yes, but it was also a shield. She was terrified, but she was also subtly beginning to feel safe. For the first time since that fateful night, Grace felt a peculiar, almost disorienting sense of peace. The desert compound was a world away from everything Grace had ever known. Its polished surfaces, hushed hallways, and the constant watchful presence of Hunter's security detail were a stark contrast to her cluttered apartment and the vibrant, chaotic pulse of Las Vegas. At first, she chafed against the sudden loss of freedom. Every movement was observed, every door required a guard to open it, every meal was brought to her. Her schedule, once her own to juggle between violin lessons and singing gigs, was now dictated by an unseen hand, designed solely, she understood, for her safety. She wanted to walk outside, to feel the sun on her face without an escort, to choose her own clothes. But Hunter's rules were absolute, unyielding. He didn't need to speak them often. His men conveyed them with quiet efficiency, and his own intense gaze was enough to reinforce their unspoken weight. She tried to argue once, a small, futile burst of defiance, but the silent, unwavering look he gave her was enough to quell it. She was here, she was safe, and her protests were insignificant against the immense power he wielded. Yet, despite the gilded cage, a peculiar shift began to occur within Grace. The constant gnawing worry about overdue rent, the crushing weight of her mother's medical debts, the terrifying fear of raising a child alone while being hunted by killers, all of it had been lifted. Hunter, without a single question, had provided for every conceivable need. Luxurious, soft clothing appeared in her closet. Meals tailored to her pregnancy were served on fine china, and the silence of the compound meant no more blaring sirens or the intrusive chatter of casino patrons. Slowly, hesitantly, Grace found a strange, almost unsettling comfort in his unyielding authority. The immense burden she had carried for so long had vanished, replaced by the heavy, yet oddly soothing blanket of his control. She started to yield, not out of weakness, but out of a growing recognition of her own vulnerability and his undeniable capability. There was a peculiar peace in letting someone else take charge, especially someone so undeniably powerful and efficient. She had spent her entire adult life responsible for everything. Now, for the first time, she was responsible for nothing but herself and the tiny life within her, and Hunter was responsible for their safety. Hunter was often a silent, imposing presence. He moved through the compound with a quiet grace that belied his size, a watchful shadow. Grace would catch him observing her, his dark eyes intense, assessing, almost possessive. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a constant. Heavy weight, a palpable force that settled over her, reminding her of his unwavering command. It was in these quiet moments that she began to catch glimpses of a deeper, more primal protectiveness. She was sitting in the sunlit lounge one afternoon, a hand resting instinctively on her still flat belly, a gentle, unconscious gesture of connection to the life growing inside her. Hunter entered the room, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet, his gaze, usually so unreadable, softened almost imperceptibly as it fell upon her hand, then flickered to her eyes. In that brief, unguarded moment, Grace saw it, a fierce, absolute resolve, a promise of unyielding protection. His hand, large and strong, rested for a fleeting second on the table beside her, his thick silver watch glinting in the light. It was a silent, powerful symbol of his demanding presence, a physical manifestation of the control he exerted over their world. Grace found herself leaning into his strength, recognizing with a clarity that both awed and humbled her that her safety and that of her unborn child was his paramount concern. She was no longer just his captive. She was his to protect, and in that understanding she found a strange, deep sense of belonging. The quiet hum of the compound, once a peculiar comfort, now felt like the low thrum of a tightening drum. Grace felt it in the increased vigilance of the guards, the subtle shift in Hunter's already formidable demeanor, a coiled tension that permeated every corner of their gilded cage. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that the external threat had drawn closer. The fragile peace she had begun to cultivate within his walls was about to be shattered. One evening, Hunter summoned her to his private study. The room was vast, filled with dark wood and the scent of old leather and power. He stood by a large window, his back to the sweeping desert vista, his hands clasped behind him. His silhouette was an imposing fortress against the fading light. Grace felt small, almost insignificant as she entered, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft thud that sealed her into his world. He turned, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her instinctively still. There was no warmth in them tonight, only a cold, calculating fury she knew wasn't directed at her, but rather at the unseen enemy. "The hotel manager," he stated, his voice a low growl that vibrated with suppressed violence. "He sold the surveillance footage, every moment of that night, Grace, to the cartel." A gasp tore from her throat. Her blood ran cold. The fleeting, anonymous encounter, her moment of reckless surrender, had been broadcast, packaged, and handed to the very men who now hunted her. The violation was profound, a sickening invasion of her most private memory. She felt exposed, vulnerable, a raw target. Her secret, the tiny life growing inside her, was no longer just a secret. It was a weapon, openly displayed for his enemies to see and covet. Hunter watched her, his gaze unwavering, as if assessing the impact of his words. "They knew you were with me. They knew you were carrying something precious." His eyes dropped to her belly for a fraction of a second, a possessive flicker that held a terrifying promise of retribution. "They want to use you to break me." Grace's mind reeled. The sheer depravity of it, the chilling calculation, stole her breath. She had been a pawn, an unsuspecting piece in a game she hadn't even known existed. The betrayal stung, a sharp, bitter taste in her mouth. But then a new wave of realization, even more profound, washed over her. "The night we met," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It wasn't random, was it?" Hunter's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. He walked towards his desk, picking up a heavy, old-fashioned letter opener, turning it over and over in his strong fingers. "Your father," he began, his voice devoid of emotion, "a security guard. Years ago, he took a bullet for me." Grace stared, utterly stunned. Her father, the man she thought had abandoned her, who had been a ghost in her memory, had once saved Hunter King's life. The world tilted on its axis. Her chance encounter, her reckless surrender, the entire trajectory of her life since that night, it had all been orchestrated. Hunter had been watching her, calculating, waiting. The trust she had slowly, tentatively begun to place in him felt like sand crumbling through her fingers. Was she merely a debt repaid, a protected asset? He met her gaze again, his eyes dark and unwavering. "I was there that night because I needed to see if you were safe, if you were struggling." He didn't offer apologies, only facts, delivered with the cold precision of a general. "When I found out about the cartel, about what they wanted to do to you, to our child," he trailed off, but the unspoken threat in the air was palpable, terrifying. Grace felt a whirlwind of emotions, betrayal, shock, a strange, undeniable sense of a preordained destiny. She was angry, yes, but beneath it, a deeper, more primal understanding began to surface. He had been there, watching, because of her father. He had intervened, brutally, to save her. "They will not touch you," Hunter declared, his voice cutting through her turmoil. He walked to her, stopping inches away, his towering presence an unyielding wall. "They will not touch our child. My entire operation, every resource, every man I command is between you and them. Do you understand, Grace?" His gaze bored into hers, demanding not just comprehension, but absolute acceptance. She looked up at him, her heart still thrumming with the shock of his revelations, but also with the immense, undeniable weight of his promise. The fortress around them, already formidable, now felt like an impenetrable vault, sealed by his will. She was angry that he had lied, that their encounter had been a calculated move. But the sheer, overwhelming force of his protectiveness, the unwavering certainty in his dark eyes, was undeniable. He had dragged her into his fortified world, yes, but he was also putting his entire security operation between her and danger, and in that terrifying absolute protection, Grace found a strange, desperate anchor. She nodded, a single shaky movement. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She understood. She was his to protect, to command, and to keep safe. And in a world that had suddenly become unimaginably dangerous, that terrifying truth was the only thing that offered her any hope of survival. The quiet hum of the compound, once a peculiar comfort, now felt like the low thrum of a tightening drum. Grace felt it in the increased vigilance of the guards, the subtle shift in Hunter's already formidable demeanor, a coiled tension that permeated every corner of their gilded cage. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that the external threat had drawn closer. The fragile peace she had begun to cultivate within his walls was about to be shattered. One evening, Hunter summoned her to his private study. The room was vast, filled with dark wood and the scent of old leather and power. He stood by a large window, his back to the sweeping desert vista, his hands clasped behind him. His silhouette was an imposing fortress against the fading light. Grace felt small, almost insignificant as she entered, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft thud that sealed her into his world. He turned, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her instinctively still. There was no warmth in them tonight, only a cold, calculating fury she knew wasn't directed at her, but rather at the unseen enemy. "The hotel manager," he stated, his voice a low growl that vibrated with suppressed violence. "He sold the surveillance footage, every moment of that night, Grace, to the cartel." A gasp tore from her throat. Her blood ran cold. The fleeting, anonymous encounter, her moment of reckless surrender, had been broadcast, packaged, and handed to the very men who now hunted her. The violation was profound, a sickening invasion of her most private memory. She felt exposed, vulnerable, a raw target. Her secret, the tiny life growing inside her, was no longer just a secret. It was a weapon, openly displayed for his enemies to see and covet. Hunter watched her, his gaze unwavering, as if assessing the impact of his words. "They knew you were with me. They knew you were carrying something precious." His eyes dropped to her belly for a fraction of a second, a possessive flicker that held a terrifying promise of retribution. "They want to use you to break me." Grace's mind reeled. The sheer depravity of it, the chilling calculation, stole her breath. She had been a pawn, an unsuspecting piece in a game she hadn't even known existed. The betrayal stung, a sharp, bitter taste in her mouth. But then, a new wave of realization, even more profound, washed over her. "The night we met," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It wasn't random, was it?" Hunter's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. He walked towards his desk, picking up a heavy, old-fashioned letter opener, turning it over and over in his strong fingers. "Your father," he began, his voice devoid of emotion, "a security guard. Years ago, he took a bullet for me." Grace stared, utterly stunned. Her father, the man she thought had abandoned her, who had been a ghost in her memory, had once saved Hunter King's life. The world tilted on its axis. Her chance encounter, her reckless surrender, the entire trajectory of her life since that night. It had all been orchestrated. Hunter had been watching her, calculating, waiting. The trust she had slowly, tentatively begun to place in him felt like sand crumbling through her fingers. Was she merely a debt repaid, a protected asset? He met her gaze again, his eyes dark and unwavering. "I was there that night because I needed to see if you were safe, if you were struggling." He didn't offer apologies, only facts, delivered with the cold precision of a general. "When I found out about the cartel, about what they wanted to do to you, to our child." He trailed off, but the unspoken threat in the air was palpable, terrifying. Grace felt a whirlwind of emotions: betrayal, shock, a strange, undeniable sense of a preordained destiny. She was angry, yes, but beneath it a deeper, more primal understanding began to surface. He had been there, watching because of her father. He had intervened, brutally, to save her. "They will not touch you," Hunter declared, his voice cutting through her turmoil. He walked to her, stopping inches away, his towering presence an unyielding wall. "They will not touch our child. My entire operation, every resource, every man I command is between you and them. Do you understand, Grace?" His gaze bored into hers, demanding not just comprehension, but absolute acceptance. She looked up at him, her heart still thrumming with the shock of his revelations, but also with the immense, undeniable weight of his promise. The fortress around them, already formidable, now felt like an impenetrable vault, sealed by his will. She was angry that he had lied, that their encounter had been a calculated move. But the sheer, overwhelming force of his protectiveness, the unwavering certainty in his dark eyes, was undeniable. He had dragged her into his fortified world, yes, but he was also putting his entire security operation between her and danger. And in that terrifying, absolute protection, Grace found a strange, desperate anchor. She nodded, a single shaky movement. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She understood. She was his, to protect, to command, and to keep safe. And in a world that had suddenly become unimaginably dangerous, that terrifying truth was the only thing that offered her any hope of survival. The compound, usually a haven of hushed efficiency, was suddenly pierced by a jarring urgency. Grace was in the main lounge, the soft light doing little to soothe the tension she felt, when a burst of urgent voices erupted from Hunter's study. Her heart leaped into her throat, a cold dread seizing her. She knew, with a primal certainty, that the calm they had clung to was over. A few tense moments later, a guard, grim-faced and stoic, appeared at the study door, his voice low but clear enough for Grace to hear. "Sir, the North Tower, a coordinated hit, significant damage." Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The North Tower. She knew it was one of Hunter's public business interests, a gleaming skyscraper on the edge of the Strip. This wasn't a shadow skirmish. This was a direct, violent message delivered with terrifying precision. The cartel wasn't just looking for her. They were openly challenging Hunter, daring him to come out. The walls of the compound, once a symbol of impenetrable safety, now felt like the target of an impending siege. Her fear, already a constant companion, sharpened into a trembling tremor that ran through her entire body. Hunter emerged from the study, his presence a dark, implacable storm. His jaw was set, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire that Grace had only glimpsed before. He didn't speak, but the air around him crackled with an unspoken command, a ruthless resolve that made his men move with even greater speed and silence. Grace watched him, mesmerized and terrified. He was a force of nature, utterly unstoppable when protecting what was his. There was no hesitation, no fear in him, only a relentless, calculating focus. She felt a wave of nausea, her stomach clenching. This was the true cost of her presence here, the violence her secret had unleashed. But even as fear for their lives, for the tiny life within her, threatened to overwhelm her, a profound, undeniable trust began to settle deep within her heart. This man, this terrifying TYCOON, would not let them fall. His power, once so intimidating, now felt like the only anchor in a world turned upside down. He walked towards her, his gaze intense, possessive, sweeping over her as if to reassure himself of her immediate safety. He stopped inches away, his towering height making her crane her neck to meet his eyes. The sheer scale of him, the raw power emanating from his broad shoulders and unyielding posture, was a stark reminder of their difference. He was the impenetrable wall, and she was the fragile life he shielded. "They are trying to draw me out," Hunter stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that resonated deep within her. "They want me to expose myself, to leave you vulnerable." He reached out, his hand, large and strong, settling gently on her still flat belly. His thick silver watch, a symbol of his unwavering presence, glinted in the soft light. The touch was brief, but absolute, a silent claim. Grace instinctively covered his hand with her own, her fingers tracing the cold metal of his watch. His skin felt warm, unyielding, a promise of steadfastness. Her fear was palpable, a constant thrum, but under his touch, under his gaze, it began to recede, replaced by a growing absolute trust in his strength. "They will not touch you," he vowed, his voice gaining an edge of steel that sent a shiver of both terror and profound safety through her. "They will not touch our child. Trust me, Grace. My protection is absolute." It was more than a promise. It was a command, a primal declaration of ownership and defense. In that moment, surrounded by the echoes of violence, Grace found herself leaning into him, her entire faith, her very survival resting on his powerful words. She felt small, utterly enveloped by his presence, but also profoundly safe. His command wasn't a burden, it was a lifeline. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sheer, overwhelming force of his will wash over her. She would trust him. She had to. There was no other choice. The compound, once a bastion of peace, now thrummed with a new, terrifying energy. The cartel's brazen attack on Hunter's North Tower had ignited a fuse, transforming the cautious defense into an all-out war. Grace felt it in the air, a palpable tension that tightened her nerves. Her days, though still shielded within the lavish walls, were filled with the distant sounds of urgent communications, the brisk, silent movements of Hunter's security detail, and the heavy weight of his unrelenting presence. Hunter himself had shifted. He was no longer just the silent, watchful protector. He was a predator in full, terrifying motion. Grace saw it in his eyes, which held a chilling, calculating focus she hadn't witnessed before. He moved with a grim purpose, his commands sharp and decisive, his very posture radiating an unyielding, dangerous resolve. He wasn't waiting for the cartel to strike again. He was striking back, dismantling their network piece by brutal piece. She would catch snippets of conversations from the guards, hushed reports of raids and broken supply lines, of cartel associates disappearing without a trace. Each report, though terrifying in its implications, paradoxically deepened her sense of security. Hunter wasn't just defending her. He was eradicating the threat, tearing down the world that dared to touch what was his. His ruthlessness, though chilling, was an unbreachable wall, and she was firmly behind it. He was protecting his den, and she was the fragile, precious life within it. Her own body was changing too. The subtle swell of her belly was becoming more evident, a gentle curve that spoke of the life growing within her. It was a constant, visible reminder of the stakes, a silent beacon that seemed to amplify Hunter's protectiveness to a primal, almost savage level. His gaze would linger there, on her stomach, a possessive intensity that made her both vulnerable and profoundly cherished. The security measures, already stringent, became almost suffocating. Guards were everywhere, their faces grim, their weapons more visible. Hunter had tightened the perimeter, reinforced every entry point, turning the compound into an impenetrable fortress. Grace understood, without him having to utter a single word, that any attempt to harm her, any breach of his domain, would be met with overwhelming deadly force. It was an unspoken creed, understood by every man who served him. Touch her, and you die. She saw it in the way his head of security, a man named Thorn, would look at her, a deferential, almost reverent respect, mixed with an unwavering, deadly loyalty. They were Hunter's men, and their purpose was clear, to ensure her survival at any cost. One evening, Hunter stood before her in the main lounge, the low lights casting long shadows. He hadn't touched her, hadn't raised his voice, but his presence was a physical pressure against her skin. "You will not leave this wing without an escort," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that left no room for argument. "No exceptions. If there is a threat, you will follow Thorn's commands without hesitation. Do you understand, Grace?" She looked up at him, her heart thrumming with a mixture of awe and fear. His size, his sheer unyielding power, was a stark reminder of their absolute difference. He was the dominant, the protector, and she was the one who needed his strength. Her initial anger at his deception had long since faded, replaced by a deep, almost instinctual understanding that her safety and that of their child rested entirely in his hands. She nodded, her voice soft but firm. "I understand, Hunter." A flicker, almost imperceptible, passed through his dark eyes, a brief acknowledgement, a silent satisfaction at her submission. His hand, large and strong, rested for a fleeting moment on her shoulder, a possessive, grounding touch that sent a shiver through her. It wasn't a caress, it was a claim, a physical manifestation of his absolute control. And in that moment, Grace felt the last vestiges of her resistance dissolve. She was yielding to him completely, not just because she had to, but because she recognized it as her only path to survival, to protection, to a future for the life she carried. The world outside was a terrifying place, but within Hunter's unbreachable walls, under his fierce, absolute command, Grace felt safer than she had ever been. The compound was a fortress, but even fortresses could tremble. Grace felt it in the subtle shift of the air, the sudden, sharp crackle of static from a guard's earpiece, the way the already taut silence within the walls became an unbearable strain. Hunter had been gone for hours, his absence a gaping hole in the compound's protective aura, leaving behind only the heavy weight of his command. She knew he was out there, confronting the cartel, dismantling their operations piece by piece. She'd been told to remain in her quarters, under Thorn's direct supervision, but the knowledge of the danger he faced, the violence he was unleashing on their behalf, was a constant, sickening thrum in her veins. Then came the jolt, a distant, muffled explosion, followed by the rapid-fire staccato of automatic weapons, resonated through the thick walls, vibrating deep in her bones. Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. It was a close call, she knew it, even though Thorn, ever stoic, merely tightened his grip on the rifle he carried and moved closer to her door. She wasn't meant to witness it, not truly, but the echoes of that brutal confrontation seeped into every corner of her mind, painting vivid, horrifying images. A decoy convoy, she overheard later, had been targeted. A sacrifice, a diversion, all to ensure her safety. The fear was overwhelming, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it a new feeling began to emerge. It wasn't defiance, but a quiet, fierce resolve. She wasn't fighting him anymore, not in her heart. She was a gentle presence in the eye of his storm, a soft counterpoint to his ruthless world. Her role, she realized, wasn't to question his methods, but to be his anchor, a still point amidst the chaos he commanded. She was the reason for his war, and she would not be a weakness. When Hunter returned hours later, he was a grim, imposing figure. Dust clung to his dark suit. A faint smear of blood, not his own, marred the cuff of his expensive shirt. His eyes, usually so unreadable, held a weariness Grace had never seen, but also an unwavering, predatory triumph. He walked into the main lounge, and the entire room seemed to shrink around him, the air thick with the aftermath of battle. Grace watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and profound relief. He was battered, dangerous, but he was here. He was safe. Her gentle nature, which had always felt like a vulnerability, now felt like a quiet strength she could offer him. She rose slowly, moving towards him with a hesitant grace, her hand instinctively resting on the slight swell of her belly. He stopped, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing, reassuring himself. His eyes softened, almost imperceptibly, as they lingered on her form, a flicker of something raw and possessive. She felt small beneath his scrutiny, yet utterly protected. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently laid her hand on his arm, just above the bloodied cuff. It was a small, unexpected comfort, a tender gesture in a world of harsh realities. His muscles, tense and coiled, relaxed fractionally under her touch. He didn't pull away. He simply stood there, letting her presence, her quiet strength wash over him. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her voice husky with emotion. It was a foolish question, given the violence he had just walked through, but it was all she could offer. He looked down at her, his dark eyes intense, acknowledging her concern without a spoken word. His hand, large and calloused, covered hers on his arm, a gentle pressure that was still undeniably a claim. The thick silver watch on his wrist pressed against her skin, a cold, solid reminder of his unwavering power. "Just follow my lead, Grace," he rumbled, his voice low, a deep vibration that resonated through her. His gaze was unwavering, a silent promise. "We will be safe." It was a command, a reassurance, and a declaration all at once. His grip tightened, a possessive comfort. Grace leaned into him, letting the sheer force of his presence envelop her. In his unyielding strength, in his absolute control, she found an unexpected peace. She would follow his lead, always. She would be his soft anchor. And under his fierce, absolute protection, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that they truly would be safe. The compound, once a bastion of peace, now thrummed with a new, terrifying energy. The cartel's brazen attack on Hunter's North Tower had ignited a fuse, transforming the cautious defense into an all-out war. Grace felt it in the air, a palpable tension that tightened her nerves. Her days, though still shielded within the lavish walls, were filled with the distant sounds of urgent communications, the brisk, silent movements of Hunter's security detail, and the heavy weight of his unrelenting presence. Hunter himself had shifted. He was no longer just the silent, watchful protector. He was a predator in full, terrifying motion. Grace saw it in his eyes, which held a chilling, calculating focus she hadn't witnessed before. He moved with a grim purpose, his commands sharp and decisive, his very posture radiating an unyielding, dangerous resolve. He wasn't waiting for the cartel to strike again. He was striking back, dismantling their network piece by brutal piece. She would catch snippets of conversations from the guards, hushed reports of raids and broken supply lines, of cartel associates disappearing without a trace. Each report, though terrifying in its implications, paradoxically deepened her sense of security. Hunter wasn't just defending her. He was eradicating the threat, tearing down the world that dared to touch what was his. His ruthlessness, though chilling, was an unbreachable wall, and she was firmly behind it. He was protecting his den, and she was the fragile, precious life within it. Her own body was changing too. The subtle swell of her belly was becoming more evident, a gentle curve that spoke of the life growing within her. It was a constant, visible reminder of the stakes, a silent beacon that seemed to amplify Hunter's protectiveness to a primal, almost savage level. His gaze would linger there, on her stomach, a possessive intensity that made her both vulnerable and profoundly cherished. The security measures, already stringent, became almost suffocating. Guards were everywhere, their faces grim, their weapons more visible. Hunter had tightened the perimeter, reinforced every entry point, turning the compound into an impenetrable fortress. Grace understood, without him having to utter a single word, that any attempt to harm her, any breach of his domain, would be met with overwhelming deadly force. It was an unspoken creed, understood by every man who served him. Touch her, and you die. She saw it in the way his head of security, a man named Thorne, would look at her, a deferential, almost reverent respect, mixed with an unwavering, deadly loyalty. They were Hunter's men, and their purpose was clear, to ensure her survival at any cost. One evening, Hunter stood before her in the main lounge, the low lights casting long shadows. He hadn't touched her, hadn't raised his voice, but his presence was a physical pressure against her skin. "You will not leave this wing without an escort," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that left no room for argument. "No exceptions. If there is a threat, you will follow Thorne's commands without hesitation. Do you understand, Grace?" She looked up at him, her heart thrumming with a mixture of awe and fear. His size, his sheer unyielding power, was a stark reminder of their absolute difference. He was the dominant, the protector, and she was the one who needed his strength. Her initial anger at his deception had long since faded, replaced by a deep, almost instinctual understanding that her safety and that of their child rested entirely in his hands. She nodded, her voice soft but firm. "I understand, Hunter." A flicker, almost imperceptible, passed through his dark eyes, a brief acknowledgement, a silent satisfaction at her submission. His hand, large and strong, rested for a fleeting moment on her shoulder, a possessive, grounding touch that sent a shiver through her. It wasn't a caress, it was a claim, a physical manifestation of his absolute control. And in that moment, Grace felt the last vestiges of her resistance dissolve. She was yielding to him completely, not just because she had to, but because she recognized it as her only path to survival, to protection, to a future for the life she carried. The world outside was a terrifying place, but within Hunter's unbreachable walls, under his fierce, absolute command, Grace felt safer than she had ever been. The air within the compound had settled into a heavy, almost unbearable quiet, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like the held breath before a storm. The past weeks had seen Hunter's ruthless counteroffensive tear through the cartel's operations, silencing their threats with brutal efficiency. Grace had heard fragmented reports, seen the grim satisfaction in Thorne's eyes, and understood the immense, terrifying power Hunter wielded. He was indeed the city's most feared tycoon, and she was the fragile, protected center of his dark world. Now, the final confrontation loomed, a shadow stretching over every corner of their fortress. Grace was physically safe, cocooned in the luxurious comfort of her wing, but emotionally, she was taut, a violin string stretched to its breaking point. Her body, now noticeably rounded with the life growing within her, felt both vulnerable and incredibly strong. She understood that Hunter was preparing for the final, decisive strike, the moment when he would step out of the fortified compound and face the last of their enemies head-on. The thought alone sent a shiver through her, a cold dread that clung to her heart. Hunter found her in the sunlit lounge, her hands resting protectively on her belly. He entered silently, his presence immediately filling the vast room, displacing the quiet air. He was a coiled spring, radiating an intense, dangerous energy. His dark suit, perfectly tailored, seemed to ripple with suppressed power, and his eyes, usually unreadable, held a fierce, absolute resolve that made her breath catch. He stopped before her, his height and breadth casting a long shadow over her. There was no need for words between them to convey the gravity of the moment. He reached out, his large hand gently covering hers, where it rested on her stomach. His touch was firm, possessive, a silent claim that resonated deep within her. The thick silver watch on his wrist gleamed, a cold, hard counterpoint to the warmth of his skin. "Thorn will be with you," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through her, a command that left no room for question. "The compound will be locked down. Do not leave this room, not for any reason until I return." Grace met his gaze, her heart thrumming with a mixture of fear and absolute trust. She saw the unwavering certainty in his eyes, the promise of his return, and the unspoken vow that he would secure their future, no matter the cost. He was ensuring she had everything she could possibly need, down to the smallest comfort, before he left for the climax of his war. He had ordered specific meals prepared, ensured her favorite music was available, even had a soft shawl placed near her chair. These small gestures, amidst the immense danger, spoke volumes of his meticulous care, his silent devotion. His gaze intensified, sweeping over her face, lingering on her eyes, then dropping to her belly, a possessive fire burning in their depths. It was a silent promise, an unshakable certainty that she and their child were everything to him, the core of his existence, the reason for his fight. A deep, unspoken connection passed between them then, a silent current of understanding that transcended words. Grace knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that he would do whatever it took. And in that moment, all her lingering anxieties, all her fears, coalesced into a fierce, unwavering support for him. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and gently placed it over his, her fingers tracing the warm skin of his knuckles. It was a silent promise of her unwavering support, her absolute devotion. Her voice, though soft, was firm, with a newfound conviction. "Be safe, Hunter," she whispered, her eyes holding his. A flicker, almost imperceptible, passed through his dark eyes, a brief acknowledgement of her strength, her quiet surrender. His hand tightened on hers, a possessive, grounding pressure. He would return. He would secure their future. He would protect what was his. And in that silent, powerful exchange, Grace knew, with absolute certainty, that her place was with him, always. The black SUVs cut through the inky desert night, their headlights carving tunnels of light through the vast, empty expanse. The glittering neon of Las Vegas, once a vibrant promise, was now a receding shimmer in the rearview mirror, shrinking with every mile. Grace sat in the back of the lead vehicle, Thorn in the passenger seat beside the driver, Hunter a silent, formidable presence beside her. His arm, solid and unyielding, was a constant, almost casual weight against hers, a silent tether in the increasing tension. She understood this journey was no escape, but a deliberate confrontation, a trap Hunter had meticulously set for the cartel. The air inside the SUV crackled with an unspoken readiness, a predatory calm that was both terrifying and strangely reassuring. Grace clutched her hands in her lap, her knuckles white. Her gaze darted between Hunter's stoic profile and the endless, desolate landscape rushing past. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird desperate for flight, but she forced herself to breathe, to trust. Hunter had made his promise, and in his world, his word was absolute. She felt vulnerable, exposed in the vastness. But his presence beside her, the sheer, undeniable force of his will, was a powerful shield against the encroaching fear. Suddenly, the convoy slowed. Not a halt, but a deliberate, almost imperceptible reduction in speed. Hunter's head turned, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. Grace followed his gaze, her breath catching. From the shadowy dunes, dark shapes began to materialize, cars, moving fast, converging on them from every direction. The desert, once empty, was now alive with menace. The air inside the SUV turned thick, heavy with the scent of impending violence. "Stay down," Hunter's voice rumbled, low and guttural, a command that reverberated through her very bones. He didn't wait for her to obey. His large hand, firm and possessive, pressed against her shoulder, pushing her down onto the plush leather seat. Before she could fully register the shock, he was moving, a blur of controlled power. The door beside him opened and he stepped out, an imposing, terrifying figure silhouetted against the stark desert light. Grace huddled low, her arms instinctively wrapping around her growing belly. The world outside exploded, the roar of engines, the screech of tires, then the brutal, deafening crack of gunfire ripped through the night. She heard shouts, the sickening thud of impacts, the desperate cries of men. It was a cacophony of pure, unbridled violence unfolding just meters from her. The SUV became a steel cocoon, vibrating with the force of the battle. Thorne, ever vigilant, turned in his seat, his rifle already raised, his body a solid barrier. Another guard, already positioned, pressed himself against the back window, his weapon trained outward. Hunter's jacket, which he had shrugged off a moment before, was now draped over Grace's stomach, a heavy, dark shield, a tangible extension of his protection. She could smell his scent on it, expensive cologne. Something uniquely his, now mixed with the acrid tang of gunpowder. She wanted to scream, to close her eyes and block out the horror, but she couldn't. Every sound, every vibration seeped into her, painting a gruesome picture in her mind. Men were falling. Hunter was unleashing brutal, calculated violence, moving with a terrifying efficiency that left no room for doubt or mercy. This was the predator she had glimpsed, now fully unleashed, eradicating every threat to his domain. Her fear was intense, a cold, gripping terror, but it was not of Hunter. No, her fear was for him, for their child, for the fragile future they held. It was for the danger he was so ruthlessly, brutally eliminating. She trusted him, utterly and completely. She felt small, fragile, utterly at his mercy, yet paradoxically safer than she had ever been in her life. His violence, terrifying as it was the ultimate act of protection, a testament to his unwavering command. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos began to subside. The gunshots became sporadic, then ceased altogether. The shouts faded into groans, then into a chilling, absolute silence. The only sound was the heavy thrum of the idling SUV engine and Grace's own ragged breathing. She slowly pushed herself up, her eyes wide, scanning the dim interior. Thorne remained unmoving, his gaze fixed on the desert outside. Hunter was still out there. The thought sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. The silence was more terrifying than the noise, a stark testament to the finality of his actions. She knew he had won. He always won, and in that terrifying, absolute victory, Grace knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that he would return to her, to his protected, cherished possession. The silence that descended upon the desert was chilling, heavier than the roar of the battle had been. Grace remained huddled, Hunter's jacket still clutched over her belly, her body trembling uncontrollably. Thorne, ever a sentinel, finally lowered his rifle, but his gaze remained fixed on the scene outside, unreadable. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid tang of gunpowder, a visceral reminder of the brutal efficiency of Hunter's wrath. Slowly, hesitantly, Grace pushed herself upright, her limbs stiff and aching. Her eyes, wide and still clouded with terror, scanned the desolate landscape through the tinted windows. Dark shapes lay motionless on the sand. Twisted metal glinted under the distant city lights. The last of the enemy utterly eliminated. Hunter had won. He always won. Then she saw him. He stood amidst the carnage, a lone, imposing figure. Dust clung to his dark suit. Blood, not his own, marred the pristine fabric, and his powerful frame seemed to radiate a raw, dangerous energy. He was battered, lethal, but undeniably victorious. He was everything fierce and unforgiving, a primal force of nature unleashed. His head turned slowly, his dark eyes sweeping across the desolate scene, then locking onto the SUV. Grace felt the intensity of his gaze even through the glass, a magnetic pull that rooted her to her seat. He began to walk towards them, his strides long and purposeful, his presence overwhelming the silence, commanding all attention. He was a predator returning to his den, victorious, and her heart hammered with a mixture of awe and profound, undeniable fear. Yet beneath the fear, a strange, powerful sense of safety began to unfurl, a warmth spreading through her chest. He was here. He was alive. Just as Hunter reached their vehicle, the distinct thrumming of rotor blades sliced through the night air. A large, dark helicopter, its powerful searchlight piercing the darkness, descended from above, kicking up a swirling vortex of desert dust. Grace watched, bewildered, as it settled on a clear patch of ground a short distance away, its landing gear retracting with a soft hiss. Figures in official-looking uniforms emerged, moving with a controlled urgency. Federal protection, she realized with a jolt, a contingency Hunter must have arranged, a way out. The helicopter offered a different life, a path away from the violence, from the dangerous world Hunter commanded. It was an escape, a chance to raise her child in peace, free from the constant threat that clung to him like a second skin. She could walk away, vanish into a safer existence, far from the shadows of Las Vegas and the ruthless power of Hunter King. But then her gaze, drawn as if by an invisible thread, returned to Hunter. He stood by the SUV, his eyes still locked on hers through the window, his expression unreadable, yet radiating an unyielding possessiveness. Bloodied and dangerous, he was the embodiment of the storm. But he was her storm. He was the one who had dragged her into his fortified world, yes, but he was also the one who had shielded her, commanded her, protected her with every fiber of his being. He was the one who had brought her to this terrifying absolute safety. A profound, undeniable truth settled in her heart. The helicopter offered safety, yes, but it was a cold, distant safety, a lonely existence. Hunter offered a fierce, absolute protection, a demanding, all-consuming belonging. He was danger, he was power, but he was also the unyielding wall between her and a world that sought to harm them. He was the only one who could truly keep them safe. Her decision, when it came, was not a conscious thought, but an instinct, a primal pull. Grace reached for the door handle, her movements slow but resolute. Thorne, ever watchful, gave her a brief, questioning glance, but she met his eyes with a newfound conviction that silenced any potential protest. She pushed the door open and stepped out of the SUV, the cool desert air washing over her, carrying the faint scent of violence and Hunter's expensive cologne. The helicopter's rotors whirred, a beckoning promise of escape. The federal agents, seeing her, began to move towards her, their faces etched with professional concern. But Grace didn't look at them. She didn't look at the helicopter. Her eyes were fixed on Hunter, standing a few yards away, his gaze still fiercely locked on hers. He was a dark, imposing silhouette against the pale desert sky, a stark and powerful figure amidst the wreckage. She took a step, then another, walking past the bewildered federal agents, past the path to freedom. Her feet, steady now, carried her directly towards him. With each step, the fear receded further, replaced by a surge of unshakable conviction, an utter devotion that settled deep in her soul. She stopped before him, looking up into his dark, unwavering eyes. He was a towering presence, his sheer power a palpable force, but she no longer felt small or insignificant. She felt cherished, protected, utterly his. Grace reached out, her hand, small and delicate, finding his. His fingers, large and strong, immediately closed around hers, a possessive, unyielding grip that sent a shiver of belonging through her. The thick silver watch on his wrist pressed against her skin, a cold, hard symbol of his unwavering presence, his absolute command. She looked at him, at the blood on his suit, at the fierce, predatory triumph in his eyes, and a soft, resolute smile touched her lips. Her voice, though quiet, was firm with a newfound conviction, echoing her absolute choice, her eternal surrender. "Ours," she whispered, her gaze holding his. It was a vow, a declaration of their unbreakable bond, a complete acceptance of him, his power, his protection, and the dangerous, absolute love that was undeniably theirs. She chose him, his world, his darkness, forever. The desert, scarred and silent, was a chilling testament to Hunter's victory. In the days that followed the brutal confrontation, Grace felt the last vestiges of the cartel's threat slowly dissolve, like smoke dissipating into the vast, clear sky. Whispers from the guards, hushed reports from Thorne, all confirmed it. Hunter had not just repelled them, he had utterly annihilated them. He had moved with a relentless, terrifying efficiency, dismantling their operations, erasing their presence from the city he now undeniably controlled. His dominion was absolute, unquestioned. The city, once a glittering maze of danger, now bowed to him, and Grace, nestled securely within his compound, felt the profound, chilling weight of that power. The compound, once a gilded cage, now truly felt like home. Her decision in the desert, her unwavering choice to walk to him, to take his hand and claim him as ours, had forged an unbreakable bond, a connection forged in fire and blood. The luxurious walls no longer felt like a prison, but a sanctuary, a fortified haven built specifically for her, for them. She moved through the expansive rooms with a newfound ease, her steps confident, her heart settled. The immense burden of her past life, the constant struggle and fear, had vanished, replaced by the heavy yet comforting blanket of Hunter's absolute protection. Grace found herself gravitating towards the large windows that overlooked the desert, no longer seeing it as an empty, threatening expanse, but as the vast, quiet landscape that held their world. She was no longer just his protected, but his cherished partner, the soft heart of his formidable empire. Her gentle nature, once a perceived weakness, was now, she understood, her strength within his world, a counterbalance to his relentless power. She had fully accepted her place by his side, yielding to his strength, not out of fear, but out of a deep, almost primal understanding that this was where she belonged. Hunter, victorious and secure in his dominion, began to reveal more of the tenderness that lay beneath his hard exterior. It was a subtle transformation, not a complete softening, but a controlled unveiling, reserved only for her. His protective instincts, once a fierce, primal force, now evolved into a deep, possessive love that manifested in quiet gestures, in the unwavering intensity of his gaze. He would find her in the lounge, a book in her lap, her hand resting unconsciously on her growing belly. He would simply stand there, silent, watching her, his presence a heavy, comforting weight. His dark eyes, usually so sharp and assessing, would soften as they swept over her, a possessive warmth replacing their usual command. He rarely spoke of his world outside the compound, but in these moments his silence spoke volumes. It was a constant reassurance of her safety, of her worth to him. One evening, as she sat by the fire, a soft melody playing on the compound's hidden speakers, he approached. His footsteps were silent on the thick rug, but she felt his presence before she saw him. He stopped beside her chair, towering, his shadow enveloping her. Grace looked up, her heart a gentle flutter in her chest. His hand, large and strong, reached out not to command but to caress, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her jaw, his thumb brushing softly over her cheek. It was a rare, unguarded touch, brimming with a possessive affection that made her breath catch. His gaze was intense, dark, and fathomless, but in their depths Grace saw a profound tenderness, a silent devotion that promised eternal protection. The thick silver watch on his wrist, a symbol of his power and control, now felt like a warm, familiar weight against her skin. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her temple, a ghost of a kiss that sent a shiver of pure belonging through her. "Safe," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through her, a private assurance meant only for her. "Always safe, Grace." It was more than a statement. It was a vow, a testament to his absolute control, to his unyielding commitment. His embrace, though silent, was a fortress, and Grace leaned into his strength, feeling utterly cherished, completely protected. She was the soft heart of his dark empire, and in his demanding, possessive love, she found a peace deeper than any she had ever known. She was his, and he was hers, forever bound in a world he had built just for them. Months later, the desert sun, now a familiar and comforting presence, streamed through the high windows of the nursery, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Grace sat on a plush velvet chair, her violin tucked beneath her chin, drawing out soft, gentle lullabies. Her fingers, once accustomed to playing for indifferent casino patrons, now moved with a profound tenderness, each note a whispered promise of love and safety. Their baby, a tiny, perfect bundle of life, slept peacefully in a crib that Grace knew cost more than her old Las Vegas apartment, a silent testament to the vast, opulent world Hunter had built around them. The high-security compound, once a symbol of her forced protection, was now truly her home. She moved through its halls with an innate sense of belonging, her every need anticipated, her every comfort assured. The constant vigilance of Hunter's men, once a reminder of danger, now felt like an invisible, comforting embrace, a testament to his unwavering commitment to her and their child. She was no longer just the protected. She was the cherished heart of his impenetrable world, the soft center of his formidable empire. From the adjacent room, the low murmur of Hunter's voice drifted in. Grace didn't need to hear the words to know their weight. He was still the city's most feared tycoon, still negotiating bloody truces, managing the vast, shadowy network that controlled so much. She imagined him there, formidable and unyielding, his sharp mind dissecting complex deals, his presence commanding absolute obedience. That part of him, the ruthless, dangerous force, remained intact. It was the part that kept them safe, that built their fortress, that eradicated any threat before it could even whisper her name. A soft click of the door brought her out of her thoughts. Hunter stepped into the nursery, his presence immediately filling the sunlit room, displacing the quiet air. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, his broad shoulders seeming to absorb the light. His eyes, dark and intense, found hers first, then dropped to the sleeping baby in the crib, and Grace watched, mesmerized, as the hardened edges of his face softened, almost imperceptibly. His gaze returned to her, a silent, profound devotion burning in their depths. The immense power he wielded, the ruthless command she knew he exerted, seemed to melt away in this quiet, sacred space. He was a force of nature, yes, but in here, with her and their child, he was utterly, irrevocably soft. He walked to the crib, his movements fluid and silent, and Grace felt a familiar shiver run through her. He was still so large, so overwhelmingly powerful, but his touch, when he reached into the crib, was impossibly gentle. His large hand, usually gripping the controls of his empire, now carefully, tenderly, lifted their sleeping baby. He held the child close, rocking them with an unexpected paternal grace, a picture of strength, cradling innocence. Grace lowered her violin, her heart full to bursting. She saw the subtle curve of his lips, a rare, soft smile, as he gazed at their child. This was her Hunter, the man who had dragged her into his dangerous world, the man who had promised absolute protection and who now, in this quiet moment, offered a tenderness that was solely theirs. He turned, his eyes finding hers over the baby's head, and walked towards her. His presence enveloped her, a warm, heavy blanket of belonging. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers, a slow, deep kiss that spoke of ownership, of gratitude, of a fierce, possessive love. His arms, still cradling their child, tightened around her, drawing her into his immense strength. "Ours," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble against her ear. The same word she had whispered to him in the desert, now echoing back as a profound, unwavering promise. His hand, large and warm, found her stomach, resting there, a silent claim on the life they had created. The thick silver watch on his wrist, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a familiar, comforting weight against her skin. Grace leaned into him, letting the sheer force of his presence envelop her. She knew he was still the city's most feared tycoon, his hands still capable of orchestrating brutal truces. But for her, for them, he was everything. She owned his blackened heart, and he was utterly soft when it came to the singer and the child who now completed his world. They were safe, cherished, and forever under his unwavering, powerful protection, bound together in the unbreakable legacy of their love. If you enjoyed this story, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to Tales of Power and Desire to keep up with our intense romances.